"I'm filthy, inside and out," she said. The Duke pulled back the blanket and froze in shock. The storm pounds the manor walls. A ragged girl, half frozen in the snow, whispers those haunting words as the firelight flickers across her face. The Duke bends close, expecting only shame and rags, but when the blanket slips, he sees something that could shatter his house forever. The servant's whisper of scandal. A noble cousin sharpens his blade of rumor, and the girl herself carries a locket with a crest no laundress should ever possess, in a world where scandal can destroy a family overnight, and one false step can strip a duke of his title. Will compassion save them both, or will love itself bring ruin? What secret lies beneath the blanket tanned? Will it crown her as Duchess, or condemn them all? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more through the frosted windows of his luxurious carriage. Duke Alistair of Harthwick watched the swirling snow with growing irritation. The winter storm had intensified over the past hour, turning what should have been a simple journey across his estate into an arduous battle against nature's fury. The wind howled like 1,000 lost souls, rattling the carriage windows and drowning out all other sounds. "Steady on, Charles," he called to his driver through the small sliding panel. "No need to risk our necks in this weather." His voice carried the weight of authority. Even as concern creased his usually stern features, the horses' hooves crunched through deepening snow, their progress slowing with each passing minute. Alistair ran a gloved hand across his face, his thoughts turning to the warmth of his study and the pile of correspondence awaiting his attention. The delay was most inconvenient. Suddenly, the carriage lurched violently. The horses whinnied in fright, their alarmed cries cutting through the howling wind. Alistair grabbed the leather strap beside him to steady himself as the vehicle came to an abrupt halt. "Your Grace," Charles called down from his perch. "The horses, they've spotted something in the road." With a weary sigh, Alistair reached for his heavy wool cloak. "Wait here," he commanded his butler, who had already begun to rise. "I shall see to this myself." The bitter cold struck him like a physical blow as he stepped down from the carriage. Snow immediately began collecting on his shoulders and in his dark hair as he made his way to the front of the vehicle. The horses stamped nervously, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. There, half buried in a drift, lay a crumpled form. "Good Lord," Alistair muttered, dropping to one knee beside what he now recognized as a young woman. Her thin dress was little more than rags, and she clutched a threadbare blanket around herself with frozen fingers. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and her skin was deathly pale. As he touched her shoulder, her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of summer storms, though glazed with cold and exhaustion. "I'm filthy," she whispered through cracked lips, "inside and out." Then her eyes closed again. "Your Grace," his butler called from the carriage, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Surely you don't mean to." "I mean to save her life." Winters Alistair cut him off, already gathering the unconscious woman into his arms. Her body was frighteningly cold, even through his gloves. "Would you have me leave her to freeze to death on my own lands?" "But, sir, the propriety of it." "Damn propriety," Alistair growled, carrying his burden toward the carriage. "Make room there, and give me your cloak as well." The rest of the journey passed in tense silence, broken only by the woman's occasional whimpers as warmth slowly returned to her limbs. Alistair found himself studying her face, noting the fine bones beneath the dirt and cold-blanched skin. Despite her ragged appearance, there was something compelling about her features, something that spoke of strength rather than weakness. When they finally arrived at Harthwick Manor, Alistair didn't wait for the footman to assist him. He gathered the woman into his arms once more and strode through the grand entrance, leaving trails of melting snow in his wake. His boots echoed against the marble floor as servants scattered before him, their faces masks of shock and confusion. "Fires," he commanded, his voice ringing through the vast hall. "I want fires lit in the blue chamber immediately. Send for Dr. Morris. And have hot water and clean linens brought up at once." The household staff stared in horror at the sight of their master, the proper and respected Duke of Harthwick, carrying a bedraggled stranger as if she were precious cargo. Mrs. Thimbleton, his housekeeper, looked as though she might faint. "But your grace," she sputtered, "surely the servants' quarters would be more appropriate for—" "For the blue chamber, Mrs. Thimbleton," Alistair repeated firmly, "and send up Sarah to help attend her. This woman nearly died in the snow on my lands. She will be treated with all the care this household can provide." As he mounted the stairs, still carrying his unconscious charge, he could hear the furious whispers erupting below. Let them talk, he thought grimly. He had never been one to bend to the expectations of others, and he wouldn't start now, not when a life hung in the balance. Candlelight flickered against the oak-paneled walls of the small guest chamber as Duke Alistair stood near the hearth, his tall frame casting long shadows. The fire's warmth barely touched the bone-deep chill that seemed to cling to the mysterious woman they had rescued from the storm. She lay motionless on the bed, wrapped in layers of thick blankets, her face pale as fresh snow. "Your Grace," whispered Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, hovering anxiously by the door. "Should I not send for Dr. Morrison?" "The storm makes that impossible," Alistair replied, his eyes fixed on their unexpected guest. "We must do what we can until morning." A young maid hurried in with a steaming bowl of broth, bobbing a quick curtsy before setting it on the bedside table. The savory aroma of chicken and herbs filled the room, but the woman remained still, her fingers clutching something beneath the blankets against her chest. Alistair moved closer, studying her face in the warm glow. Despite the dirt and exhaustion marking her features, there was a quiet dignity in her bearing that seemed at odds with her ragged appearance. "Miss," he said softly, "you must try to warm yourself properly." When she made no response, he reached for the edge of the blanket to adjust it more securely around her shoulders. As he did so, something golden glinted in the candlelight. The Duke's hand stilled, his breath catching in his throat. There, hanging from a worn ribbon around her neck, was a locket he would have recognized anywhere. The intricate crest of House Harthwick, his family symbol for generations, was unmistakably etched into its surface. "Where did you get this?" His voice emerged sharper than intended, causing Mrs. Hughes to step forward in concern. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises clouded with fear and fever. "Please," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the locket. "It was my mother's." "Your mother?" Alistair's mind raced through possibilities. "What is your name?" Maribel, her voice was barely audible, but carried a thread of strength beneath its weakness. I am a laundress." "Was?" he prompted, pulling a chair closer to the bedside. A shadow of pain crossed her face. "I had to leave my position." "The master of the house," she swallowed hard, her next words coming out in a rush. "He made advances. When I refused him, he dismissed me with no reference." Mrs. Hughes made a small sound of distress, but Alistair raised his hand for silence. "And the locket? You say it belonged to your mother?" "Yes, Your Grace." Maribel's fingers traced the familiar crest. "She served in noble houses before I was born. She never told me how she came by it, but it was her most treasured possession." Alistair gently took the locket in his hand, examining the well-worn surface. It was genuine. He had seen its like before, given as tokens of appreciation to long-serving members of the household. But this particular piece was old, perhaps from his father's time, or even his grandfather's. The quiet moment was shattered by hurried footsteps in the hallway. The door burst open, revealing Jameson, his steward, face flushed with agitation. "Your Grace," he said, bowing hastily. "I must speak with you immediately." Alistair straightened, recognizing the urgency in his steward's tone. "What is it, Jameson?" "Word has spread below stairs, Your Grace." Jameson's eyes darted nervously to Maribel. "The servants are talking. They say you've brought in a disgraced laundress. Some recognize her from the village. There are whispers already." Mrs. Hughes pressed her lips together disapprovingly. "Gossip spreads faster than wildfire, even in a storm." Alistair looked down at the locket still in his palm, then at the worn face of the woman who carried his family's crest. The first stirrings of scandal were already taking root, threatening to grow into something that could damage the reputation he had worked so hard to maintain. Yet something about Maribel's story and the mystery of the locket demanded answers he could not ignore. Morning light crept through the frost-covered window panes, casting delicate patterns across the chamber floor. Maribel stirred beneath the warm quilts, her eyes fluttering open. The familiar weight of her mother's locket pressed against her chest, a comfort in this strange place. She tried to push herself up, but the room spun wildly, forcing her back against the pillows with a soft gasp. "Please, do not exert yourself." The Duke's deep voice came from near the doorway. He stood there, his broad shoulders blocking most of the entrance, concern etched on his stern features. "You very nearly froze to death last night, Your Grace," Maribel whispered, her voice rough. "I cannot impose upon your kindness any longer." You must rest," he interrupted firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "That is not a request, but a command." A maid entered with a breakfast tray, her curious eyes darting between the Duke and Maribel before quickly looking away. As she set down the tray, her hands trembled slightly, spilling a drop of tea onto the pristine linen. Throughout the day, whispers echoed through the manor's halls like mice scurrying behind the walls. In the kitchen, cook clucked her tongue sympathetically while kneading bread. "Poor thing," she murmured to the scullery maid. Half dead from cold, she was. But in the servants' hall, harsher voices prevailed. A laundress dismissed in disgrace. The first footman sneered. "No smoke without fire. That's what I say, and His Grace carrying her in himself." The lady's maid added, scandalized. "It simply isn't done." As evening approached, candlelight warmed the manor's grand dining room. The Duke sat alone at the massive oak table, lost in thought, when quick footsteps and the announcement of an arrival broke the silence. Lord Reginald Harthwick, the butler, intoned, his voice carefully neutral. The Duke's cousin swept in, his elegant clothes slightly disheveled from travel, his sharp features twisted with concern. "Cousin," he said, without preamble, "I came as soon as I heard." "Tell me these rumors are false." Alistair set down his wineglass carefully. "Good evening to you too, Reginald." "To what rumors do you refer?" "Don't play coy," Reginald snapped, pacing before the fire. "Word has reached London already. The Duke of Harthwick, harboring a disgraced servant girl. The gossip is spreading like wildfire through Parliament's halls. I found a dying woman in the snow." Alistair replied evenly. "Would you have had me leave her there?" Reginald's laugh was sharp and without humor. "Send her to the parish church. The workhouse, sunnywhere but here. Have you lost your senses? Your position in Parliament is precarious enough after opposing the new tax laws. This scandal could destroy everything. I will not apologize for showing basic Christian charity," Alistair said, his voice growing cold. "Charity." Reginald leaned forward, hands gripping the back of a chair. "Is that what we're calling it? A young, unmarried woman living under your roof. And not just any woman, a laundress dismissed for impropriety. The timing couldn't be worse. Lord Ashworth is looking for any excuse to block your proposals for poor law reform." The Duke rose slowly, his height forcing Reginald to step back. "Thank you for your concern, cousin. But I believe I can manage my own affairs. Can you? Reginald's voice dropped to a whisper. Remember what happened to your father when scandal touched this house? The Harthwick name barely survived. Think carefully, Alistair. Very carefully. Later that night, the Duke stood alone in his study. One hand braced against the mantelpiece as he stared into the dancing flames. The fire's warmth couldn't touch the cold weight in his chest. Reginald's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of his father's disgrace, of whispers and sideways glances that had followed their family for years. Upstairs, in her borrowed chamber, Maribel sat up in bed. Her fingers wrapped around her mother's locket. The wind howled outside like a wild beast, rattling the window panes. "Lord," she whispered, her words barely audible above the storm, "protect those who have shown me kindness. Let no harm come to them through me." She pressed the locket to her lips, remembering her mother's words about honor being worth more than gold. While the winter storm raged against the walls of Harthwick Manor, the morning sun broke through the clouds, bathing Harthwick Manor in crisp winter light. Despite her lingering weakness, Maribel could not bear to remain idle while others worked. She made her way down to the laundry, where steam rose from copper tubs and the sharp scent of lye soap filled the air. "I must do something to repay His Grace's kindness," she said softly to Mrs. Winters, the head laundress, whose lined face showed clear disapproval. After a long moment, Mrs. Winters handed her a basket of linens. "Mind you, don't strain yourself. First sign of weakness, you'll stop." In the days that followed, Maribel's quiet presence began to weave itself into the fabric of manor life. She worked steadily, her skilled hands managing the finest linens with care that even Mrs. Winters could not fault. But it was in the quiet moments between tasks that fate drew her into the Duke's path. One afternoon, she found him in the library corridor, frowning over a letter. "Your Grace seems troubled," she ventured, dropping a careful curtsy. "Estate matters," he replied, then paused, studying her face. "The tenant farmers struggle after the harsh autumn. Perhaps," Maribel said thoughtfully, "they might share resources. When I worked at the Miller estate, the smaller farms survived winter by lending each other tools and hands." The Duke's eyebrows rose, considering her words. Such encounters became more frequent, brief exchanges where her simple wisdom often cut through his noble complications. It was young Henry, however, who truly opened the door to her heart. She first met him in the kitchen gardens, a small figure hunched on a stone bench, clutching a book of hymns. "Good morning, young master," she said gently. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Do you know these songs?" he asked in a whisper, showing her the well-worn pages. "Indeed, I do. Would you like to sing them together?" From that day forward, Henry sought her out like a flower turning to the sun. In the evenings, while other servants cleared away supper, Maribel would sit by the fire in the small parlor, Henry beside her. Their voices blended in simple hymns, her clear alto supporting his sweet, hesitant soprano. Unknown to them, the Duke often lingered in the shadowed doorway, watching. The sight of his ward's face glowing with happiness stirred something deep in his chest. Henry had spoken barely a word since his mother's passing 6 months prior. Now his voice rang out in song. "Angels we have heard on high," they sang together one evening, Henry's head growing heavy against Maribel's shoulder. She stroked his dark curls, so like his guardian's. As his voice grew drowsy, sweetly singing "O'er the Plains," the Duke stepped into the firelit room as Henry's eyes fluttered closed. Maribel looked up, about to rise, but he gestured for her to remain seated. "I have not heard him sing since Alistair's voice caught." He moved closer, gazing down at his sleeping ward. "You have a gift with him. He has a tender heart," Maribel replied softly. "He needs only patience and love." Their eyes met in the flickering light. Alistair reached down to brush a lock of hair from Henry's forehead, his hand accidentally grazing Maribel's. A current seemed to pass between them at the touch. Time suspended as they remained frozen, connected by that simple contact. While the fire crackled and Henry breathed deeply in sleep, then reality rushed back. The Duke straightened, clearing his throat. "I shall have Peters carry him to bed," he said stiffly, though his voice held a note of regret. "Good evening, Miss Maribel. Good evening, Your Grace," she whispered, her hands still tingling where his had touched. She watched him stride away, his broad shoulders rigid with restored propriety. While her heart beat an unsteady rhythm in her chest, the great hall of Hearthwick Manor bustled with activity as servants prepared for the 12th night feast. Garlands of evergreen decorated the stone walls, and dozens of beeswax candles cast a warm glow across polished oak tables. The scent of roasted meats and mulled wine filled the air in the servants' corridor. Maribel smoothed her plain black dress with trembling hands. The head housekeeper had protested loudly when Duke Alistair announced his decision to have Maribel serve at the feast. "Your Grace, it isn't proper." A girl of her background, but Alistair had been firm. "She is under my protection and will not be hidden away like some shameful secret." Now Maribel stood among the other servants, holding a silver tray of delicate pastries. Her heart pounded as the great doors opened and guests began to arrive. Ladies in silk gowns swept past in clouds of French perfume, their jewels glittering in the candlelight. Gentlemen in velvet coats bowed and exchanged pleasantries. Lord Reginald arrived fashionably late, his cold eyes scanning the room until they landed on Maribel. A cruel smile twisted his lips as he made his way toward her, deliberately stepping into her path as she carried her tray. Well, well. The Duke's charity case playing at being a proper servant. His voice carried just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Tell me, girl, how does one go from warming a master's bed to serving at a noble feast?" Whispers rippled through the crowd. Maribel felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her head high. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, in perfect French. "Monsieur, perhaps you might benefit from the wisdom of Proverbs. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern." Gasps echoed through the hall. Lord Reginald's face reddened with fury and embarrassment. But it was another sound that drew all eyes, the sharp intake of breath from Dowager Lady Clarissa, who had been watching the exchange with keen interest. The elderly dowager stepped forward, her silk skirts rustling. "Good heavens," she breathed, studying Maribel's face intently. "The resemblance is remarkable. Those eyes, that proud chin, exactly like dear Margaret's." "Margaret?" Someone whispered, "The Duke's late sister." Another voice explained, "Lady." Clarissa's words set off a fresh wave of whispers. Guests huddled in small groups, heads bent together as they examined Maribel with new interest. The crude accusations of moments before transformed into speculation about hidden lineage and noble blood, the same shade of auburn hair. And did you hear her French? Impeccable accent. Margaret did travel abroad that year. Before her marriage, Reginald's triumph crumbled as he watched his attempted humiliation backfire. He retreated to a corner, scowling into his wineglass as the tide of gossip turned away from scandal and toward intrigue. Through it all, Maribel continued her duties with quiet dignity, though her hands shook slightly as she offered refreshments to the guests who now regarded her with curious speculation rather than disdain, from his position near the great fireplace. Duke Alistair had witnessed everything. His chest tightened as he watched Maribel navigate the crowd with grace he'd never noticed before. The firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair, so like Margaret's, now that Lady Clarissa mentioned it. Her movements held a natural elegance that even the finest finishing schools couldn't teach. When she passed near him with her tray, their eyes met across the crowded hall. In that moment, something shifted in Alistair's perception. The servant girl he'd rescued from the snow began to fade, replaced by a woman of unmistakable nobility of spirit, if not birth. His heart beat faster as he allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine her standing beside him not as a servant, but as something far more significant. The candlelight seemed to glow brighter around her as she moved through the hall, transforming her simple black dress into something as elegant as the finest ball gown. Alistair found he could not look away, even as his mind reeled with new possibilities. Morning sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows of Duke Alistair's study as he broke the big seal on yet another letter from London. The familiar scratch of quill against parchment filled the room as his secretary recorded the day's correspondence. But as Alistair's eyes scanned the latest missive, his hand tightened on the paper, crinkling its edges. "Leave me," he commanded, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The secretary bowed and quietly withdrew. Alone, Alistair paced before the hearth, the letter crushed in his fist. His cousin Reginald had done exactly as threatened, petitioned to Parliament to review Alistair's fitness to manage the dukedom. The charges were thinly veiled: questionable judgment and improper relations with persons of low character. The meaning was clear enough. By showing kindness to Maribel, he had given his enemies the weapon they sought. Across the manor, in the small stone chapel, Maribel knelt before Father Thomas, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colored shadows across her face. "I cannot stay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Each day I remain brings fresh scandal to his Grace's door. He has shown me such kindness, and how do I repay him? By bringing ruin to his good name." Father Thomas studied her thoughtfully. He had known Maribel's mother, woman of rare virtue who had served in noble houses before her death. "Your mother was a faithful daughter of the church," he said slowly. "She attended Mass daily, even in her final illness." Maribel's eyes filled with tears. "She taught me my prayers, my letters. She wanted better for me than a life of service." The priest nodded, rising from his chair to approach the ancient parish chest that stood in the corner. Its iron bands were dark with age. "Your mother confided many things to me before she passed. There may be records, here letters, certificates that could prove your mother's true standing. And yours? Mine." Maribel's voice caught. "But I am nothing. Less than nothing now, with my reputation stained." "Perhaps not." Father Thomas laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Give me time to search the records. And do not be too quick to flee from kindness freely given." As night fell, snow began to drift past the library windows. Maribel had slipped inside, seeking a moment of peace among the leather-bound volumes. The scratch of her candle against the holder seemed loud in the hushed room. She did not hear the door open, did not know she was no longer alone until she turned and found herself face to face with the Duke. They stood frozen, mere steps apart, the candlelight casting flickering shadows on their faces. Alistair's cravat was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw such a storm of emotion that her breath caught in her throat. She should curtsy, should murmur "Your Grace," and flee. But her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they could not say. Outside, snow continued to fall in the darkness, muffling the world in white. Inside, the candle flame danced, casting warm light across their faces. Still they stood, neither moving, neither speaking, while the space between them crackled with unspoken longing. Maribel's fingers tightened on her candlestick. The Duke's hand moved slightly, as though he might reach for her, but propriety held them both in check. The gap between their stations yawned wide as an abyss, yet, in that moment, it seemed to matter less than the pull they felt toward each other. At last, Maribel managed a small curtsy. "Good evening, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alistair inclined his head, his jaw tight with restraint. She slipped past him toward the door. The whisper of her skirts, the only sound. As she reached the threshold, she paused for just a moment, but did not look back. Then she was gone, leaving Alistair alone in the library while the snow fell silently beyond the windows. The early spring thaw had begun to soften the frozen ground, turning the estate's roads into ribbons of muddy slush. Inside the manor's great hall, candlelight flickered across the concerned faces of assembled local nobility. Lord Reginald stood before the gathering, his thin lips curved in a triumphant smile as he held aloft a yellow document. "My lords and ladies," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, "I present evidence that will shock you all." This writ, discovered in the archives, proves what that woman truly is. Duke Alistair sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white against the armrests as Reginald began to read. By order of Lord Pembroke. In the year 1642, one Sarah Collins is hereby banished from service for the theft of silver and jewels. Reginald's eyes glittered with malice. Sarah Collins, Marybelle's own mother. Shocked whispers rippled through the assembly. The Dowager Countess pressed her hand to her throat, while other nobles drew back as if the very air had become tainted. "The fruit never falls far from the tree," Reginald continued. "Can we trust the daughter of a convicted thief within these halls? What else might she steal besides silverpur? Even a dukedom?" Alistair felt every eye in the room turn to him. The weight of generations of nobility pressed down upon his shoulders. Without proof to counter Reginald's claims, his position, and more importantly, his ability to protect his ward Henry's inheritance, hung by a thread. Marybelle stood in the shadows near the servants' entrance, her face pale but composed. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Alistair felt his heart tear in two. He rose slowly, his voice cold and distant even to his own ears. "In light of this evidence, I have no choice but to dismiss Marybelle from service at Harthwick Manor. Effective immediately." The words fell like stones in the quiet hall. Marybelle's shoulders straightened, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Without a word, she turned and disappeared through the servants' door. That night, Alistair paced his study until dawn, unable to rest. When morning light crept over the horizon, he watched from his window as a small figure emerged from the servants' quarters. Marybelle wore the same thin dress she'd arrived in, her only possession, the locket that still hung around her neck. She paused at the gate, looking back at the manor one last time, then turned toward the village road. The Duke pressed his hand against the cold window glass, fighting the urge to call her back. The sound of running feet in the corridor broke his vigil. "Your Grace." A maid burst in, wringing her hands. "It's young Master Henry, sir. He's burning with fever." Alistair found his ward thrashing in sweat-soaked sheets, his small face flushed with illness. The physician had already been summoned. But Henry's weak cries tore at the Duke's heart. "Marybelle," the boy whimpered, his glazed eyes searching the room. "Where is Marybelle? I want her to sing to me." Alistair sank into the chair beside Henry's bed, taking the boy's hot hand in his own. The chamber felt hollow without Marybelle's gentle presence, her soothing voice, her quiet wisdom that had somehow become as essential as air. "She's gone." "Henry," he whispered, his throat tight. "I'm sorry." Hour after hour, he sat helpless as Henry called for the one person who could comfort him. Each cry was an accusation, each fevered plea a reminder of what his pride and position had cost them all. The empty manor echoed with absence. No more soft hymns in the evening, no more chance encounters in quiet corridors, no more shared glances that spoke volumes in silence as night fell again. Alistair watched the candlelight dance on Henry's troubled face. The boy had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep, but his small hand still clutched at empty air. searching for Maribel's comforting touch. The Duke buried his face in his hands, the weight of his decision crushing him. The halls of Hearthwick had never felt so cold, so bereft of warmth and life. In trying to preserve his title and estate, he had lost something far more precious and, he feared, it might cost not only his heart, but the life of the child he had sworn to protect. The village inn's common room buzzed with quiet chatter as Maribel wiped down tables, her arms aching from the day's work. 3 days had passed since she left Hearthwick Manor, and the innkeeper's wife had taken pity on her, offering a narrow cot in exchange for help with cooking and cleaning. The work was familiar enough, but her heart felt heavy as lead. Every time the door opened, she caught herself hoping to see the Duke's tall figure, though she knew it was foolish. The gentle warmth of the inn's hearth could not chase away the chill that had settled in her soul. Since that terrible morning, "Girl," the innkeeper called. "There's someone asking for you at the door." Maribel's pulse quickened, but it was only a messenger boy from the village church. "Father Bernard requests your presence at the rectory, miss," he said, bouncing from foot to foot against the cold. "Says it's urgent like." The late afternoon air bit through her thin shawl as Maribel made her way down the muddy lane to the church. The stone rectory stood beside it, warm lamplight glowing in its windows. Father Bernard himself opened the door at her knock, his kind face creased with concern. "Come in, child," he said, ushering her into his study. "There's something you must see." The room smelled of beeswax and old paper, its walls lined with leather-bound books. The priest moved to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, its iron hinges gleaming in the lamplight. From within, he drew out a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon. "I've spent these past days searching through the parish records," he explained, settling into his chair. "What I found, well, you should read for yourself." With trembling fingers, Maribel unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, dated 25 years ago. As she read, her eyes widened, and color drained from her face. "This cannot be," she whispered. "But it is," Father Bernard said gently. "Your mother was innocent of all charges. These letters prove it was Lord Reginald's father who took the silver and jewels, then framed your mother to hide his gambling debts. She discovered his theft and threatened to expose him, so he had her branded a thief instead." Tears splashed onto the ancient paper as Maribel read letter after letter correspondence between her mother and the previous priest, documenting the truth. There was even a confession, written by a servant who had helped plant the stolen items in her mother's quarters. "All these years," Maribel said, her voice breaking, "all these years I believed what they said about her. That she was, that we were, she could not continue." Father Bernard laid a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Your mother was a woman of great courage and integrity. She chose to leave rather than fight the accusation, knowing that a servant's word would never stand against a nobleman's, but she made sure the truth was preserved here. In God's house." Maribel pressed the letters to her heart, feeling as though a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. The shame that had shadowed her entire life began to dissolve like morning mist in sunlight. Her mother had been innocent. They had never been dirty or disgraceful, only wronged. Meanwhile, at Hearthwick Manor, darkness gathered in young Henry's chamber. The boy's fever had climbed steadily through the day, small body burning despite cool compresses and the physician's remedies. Duke Alastair had not left his side for hours, watching helplessly as Henry tossed and turned in delirium. "Maribel," the child called again and again, his voice growing weaker. "Please sing to me, Maribel." The Duke's heart clenched at each plea. He had dismissed every servant who tried to comfort the boy, knowing none could replace the gentle presence Henry so desperately wanted. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across the floor, Alastair sank to his knees beside the bed. Taking Henry's hot little hand between his own, he pressed it to his forehead. I should never have let her go, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. What a fool I've been, valuing reputation over truth. Over love, Henry whimpered in his fevered dreams, and Alistair felt tears spring to his eyes, the first he had shed since his sister's death years ago. The great manor had never felt so empty, its grandeur meaningless without the warmth of Maribel's presence. He had tried to preserve his position in society, only to find that without her, none of it held any joy. Morning sunlight gilded the frost-strimed streets of the village as Duke Alistair of Harthwick guided his horse between the cramped rows of thatched cottages. His fine black stallion's hooves clattered against the cobblestones, drawing curious faces to windows and doorways. Women paused in sweeping their stoops, and men lowered their pipes to stare. The Duke himself here, whispered a baker's wife, flour dusting her apron as she peered out her shop window. What business brings his grace to our humble streets? Murmured an elderly cobbler, shaking his head in wonder. Alistair paid them no mind, his heart thundering harder than his horse's hooves. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept since Henry took ill. The boy's fevered calls for Maribel echoed in his mind. But more than that, the ache in his own chest had become unbearable. He dismounted before the village in his polished boots splashing in a puddle of melting snow. Through the window, he caught sight of her Maribel, her sleeves rolled up as she helped the innkeeper's wife with the washing. Even in such humble work, she moved with quiet grace. The common room fell silent as he entered, the patrons rising hastily to bow. Maribel turned, her hands dripping with soapy water, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "Your Grace," she whispered, dropping into a curtsy. But Alistair strode forward, caring nothing for the shocked gasps as he knelt before her on the rough wooden floor. His fine coat dragged in spilled ale, but he noticed only the trembling of her hands, the questioning in her eyes. "I have been a fool," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "I let fear of scandal and whispered lies blind me to what truly matters. Nobility," he continued, taking her wet hands in his, "lies not in birth, but in virtue. And in that, Maribel, you surpass us all." She tried to pull away, shaking her head. "My lord, please, you shouldn't kneel to someone like me." "I kneel to the woman who showed more courage and dignity in adversity than any peer of the realm," he interrupted. "To the one who brought light back to my home and joy to my ward's heart." His voice softened. "Henry is ill with fever. He calls for you in his sleep." Tears spilled down Maribel's cheeks. The innkeeper's wife pressed a hand to her heart, and several other patrons dabbed at their eyes. "But the scandal, your position," Maribel protested weakly. "Hang the scandal," Alistair declared. "I need you. Not just for Henry's sake, but for my own. These past days without you have been darker than any winter night." He squeezed her hands. "Come home." The innkeeper stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Begging your pardon, your grace, but the lass has been nothing but proper and hard-working here. If anyone says otherwise, they'll answer to us villagers." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The baker's wife spoke up from the doorway. "We've seen how she helps others, never thinking of herself. That's true nobility, if you ask me." Maribel looked around at the supportive faces, then back to Alistair's earnest gaze. "You truly want me to return?" "More than anything," he answered. He stood, still holding her hands. "My carriage waits outside." A smile broke through her tears. "Then yes, your grace, I will come home." The common room erupted in cheers as Alistair led her out. He helped her into his carriage, and as they rolled away from the village, she finally allowed herself to lean against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "There's something else," he said softly, his fingers intertwining with hers. "If you'll have me, I mean to read the banns thrice, as is proper. I'll declare my intentions before God and everyone." He turned to meet her startled gaze. Nothing will keep me from making you my Duchess. But surely, she began. No, he said firmly, squeezing her hand. I've lived by others' expectations long enough. Love and virtue matter more than ancient titles. You've taught me that. The carriage rolled onward toward Hearthwick Manor, where candlelight beckoned them home through the winter morning. Spring sunlight streamed through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned light across the gathered congregation. Villagers in their Sunday best sat shoulder to shoulder with silk-clad nobility, all eyes fixed on the couple standing before the altar. Duke Alastair of Hearthwick stood tall in his finest coat, his usually stern expression softened by joy as he gazed at his bride. Beside him, Maribel wore a gown of cream silk, her dark hair crowned with orange blossoms. The locket bearing the Hearthwick crest gleamed at her throat, no longer a burden of mystery, but a symbol of destiny fulfilled. Young Henry, rosy-cheeked and recovered from his fever, clutched a velvet cushion bearing the rings. His eyes shone with pride as he watched the ceremony unfold. When Father Bernard asked who gave this woman in marriage, Henry stepped forward with surprising confidence. I do, he declared, his clear voice carrying through the chapel. I give my new mother to my father. Tears glistened in Maribel's eyes as she squeezed the boy's hand. In that moment, she gained not just a husband, but the son her heart had already claimed. Near the back of the chapel, Lord Reginald sat alone, his former supporters having abandoned him after Father Bernard revealed the damning letters. The documents had exposed not only his father's crimes, but generations of manipulation, leaving the disgraced lord stripped of influence and position. After the final blessing, the new Duchess of Hearthwick walked down the aisle on her husband's arm. The villagers who had stood by her in the inn now cheered and threw flower petals, while even the most proper dowagers dabbed tears from their eyes. Won over by the triumph of true love over convention, the celebration continued well into the evening. Hearthwick Manor blazed with hundreds of candles, the great hall filled with music and laughter. Servants and nobles alike raised glasses to toast the couple who had bridged ancient divides. In quiet moments between dances, guests whispered about how the new Duchess had already begun organizing aid for poor families and education for tenant children. As the festivities wound down, Alastair and Maribel stood together at the library window. Below them, the manor's gardens were beginning to bloom, winter's grip finally giving way to spring's gentle touch. The Duke drew his wife closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. Do you remember, he murmured, that stormy night when I found you in the snow? How could I forget? Maribel smiled. You gave me shelter when I had nothing, and you gave me everything in return. Alastair pressed a kiss to her temple. You brought warmth back to these cold halls, love to my heart, and a mother's grace to my son. Together they gazed out over the thawing fields of Hearthwick, the land awakening to new life just as the manor itself had awakened from its long winter of loneliness. Where once silence had reigned, now joy echoed through every corridor, and the warmth of true family filled every room. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.